At 0400, 4 Iranian fast attack boats were already spread in a loose arc east, southwest, and north of the strike group, engines idling, running dark. Nobody on the carrier knew it yet. The first sign came 17 minutes later, when the sonar watch called out a transient bearing 087, range 8,000 yards, closing on the starboard side. That single line put the entire ship on a stopwatch, and everything that followed, the turns, the decoys, the helicopter runs, the gunfire, was really about one machine. The carrier itself, more than 90,000 tons of steel, trying to outthink 6 torpedoes that had been positioned to leave it nowhere to go. The order for general quarters went out within seconds. Doors slammed shut throughout the ship. On the flight deck, an FA-18 Super Hornet that had just caught the wire sat with engines running while tow tractors dragged it clear, and 2 more fighters, already loaded on the catapults, with wings folded and pilots strapped in, never got the chance to launch. The captain took his position behind the navigation team and gave the first command of the fight. Left full rudder. It takes a carrier a long time to answer that kind of order. The bow swung first, the stern dragged seconds behind, and the whole hull leaned into the turn while chained-down aircraft strained against their tie-downs and white water climbed the starboard side. Inside Combat Information Center, the range on that first torpedo kept dropping. 7,000 yards, 6,800, 6,500, and the ship still hadn't turned fast enough to get clear. Within a minute, a second contact was confirmed to the southwest. No lights, no identification, ignoring every radio call. Then a third boat turned up, tucked against the blind side of a northbound tanker, matching its speed, hiding in its radar shadow. Then a fourth transmission came from somewhere north. 4 boats, 4 bearings, a loose ring closing around one ship. This was never harassment, it was a formation. The carrier's own systems started answering back almost immediately. An acoustic decoy went into the water astern, throwing out a signature meant to sound like the ship itself. For 3 seconds it worked. The torpedo's track bent toward the false target. Then it corrected and came straight back. The captain didn't flinch, continue the turn. But every additional degree to port opened the stern further to that second contact waiting to the southwest. And less than a minute later, a flash on the southern horizon confirmed it. A second torpedo in the water, bearing 214, 6 minutes to impact, aimed squarely at the propulsion spaces. The pattern was already visible to anyone watching the plot. The first weapon was herding the ship left, and the second was waiting exactly where that turn would take it. The ship's own helicopter went up next. An MH-60R Seahawk lifted off the tilted deck at 4:23, with its rotors already loaded, carrying surface radar, infrared and sonobuoys, sent out to find the boats doing the shooting and open some kind of lane for the ship to escape through. It had barely leveled off when the northern contact, the one hiding in sea clutter, lit off 2 more launches. 2 additional torpedoes running from the north. 4 weapons now in the water at once, closing from every direction. The box tightening exactly as the tactical officer had feared out loud only moments before. They're trying to box us in. By 4:24, the geometry had turned genuinely ugly. East, southwest, and 2 from the north, 1 crossing the bow, 1 held wide, ready to become lethal the instant the ship turned away from it. There was no direction left that didn't expose something. The escorts split off the carrier's ring to go after the shooters directly, which meant, for the first time since the alarm sounded, the carrier itself was less protected than it had been a minute earlier. The Seahawk found the third boat riding in the tanker's shadow, radioed the fix, and watched it break off and run south the moment it knew it had been seen. Meanwhile, the first torpedo, having shrugged off 1 decoy, was already inside 5,000 yards and correcting hard for the turn. The captain called for 5 more degrees of rudder. On the flight deck, sailors crouched by parked jets and watched the horizon tilt further. The next countermeasure went out at 4:26, 1 decoy from the carrier, a second from the cruiser a few hundred yards off the starboard beam, and for 2 seconds it worked before the weapon corrected again, reacquiring at 3,000 yards. There was no order to reduce speed. Slowing down would only let the thing close the distance faster than the turn could open it. A minute later, the helicopter's sonar buoys caught something else. The northern torpedo wasn't taking the shortest line in. It was diving under the layer, into colder water, hunting for a place where the ship's noisemakers would be less effective. It was thinking, in its narrow mechanical way, about how not to be fooled. At 4:27, the first torpedo lost the trail of the second decoy behind the wake and vanished into the acoustic clutter. For a moment, nobody knew if it had missed entirely, and then the sea erupted off the starboard quarter. Water came down across parked aircraft. The hull took a deep metallic hit below the waterline. A radar dropped offline. A weapons elevator froze between decks. No penetration, minor flooding, engines still turning. 3 torpedoes were still running, and there was no time to feel relieved. Outside, the first Iranian boat reversed course and came back at the formation instead of running clear. Hailed twice, it didn't answer, and the destroyer's 5-inch gun tracked it and held fire, waiting for the order that hadn't come yet. By 4:28, the helicopter had a radar lock warning of its own, the third boat illuminating it briefly before breaking contact, and a second sonar buoy caught the northern torpedo rising back toward the surface, tracking now for the bow. The tactical picture had narrowed to one workable answer, and it was the kind every submariner or destroyer sailor watching this would recognize as the hard choice. Turn into the weapon rather than away from it, trading the broad, vulnerable side of the ship for the narrow bow, and betting everything on forcing the torpedo into one last correction at close range. The captain took maybe a second to decide. Come right, steer 015. 3 American warships repositioned inside a shrinking patch of ocean while 4 torpedoes moved between them, and for a moment the whole strike group was closer to colliding with itself than to being hit. The bow steadied north with the torpedo dead ahead, range 1,900 yards, and that's when the Seahawk's infrared caught a 4th boat sitting almost motionless directly on the new heading. Engines idling, crew visibly loading another weapon onto its stern rail. The countdown on the northern torpedo hit terminal homing at the same moment, 59 seconds, with a live launch platform waiting at the far end of that same bearing. It's the kind of double bind that makes you wonder how much of combat really comes down to preparation versus who blinks first, because there was no clean answer available to anyone on that bridge in that moment. The helicopter dove below 200 feet at 4:30 and dropped an expendable decoy 800 yards ahead of the carrier's bow. The crew flying toward a point they couldn't see, generated purely off sonar prediction seconds old. The torpedo bent 3 degrees toward it, then corrected back. 36 seconds left. The northern destroyer crossed directly into the weapon's path, less than a mile ahead of the carrier, both ships turning and accelerating through the same patch of water. Officers on the destroyer's bridge calling out separation every 5 seconds. The torpedo took the bait, veered off the carrier and onto the destroyer's wake instead, a relief that immediately became somebody else's emergency. The destroyer held its heading until 700 yards, then put the rudder hard over. The weapon passed behind the stern and detonated at 4:30 and 52 seconds, throwing water over the aft deck, rattling consoles, and blinding every sonar in the inner formation with noise for several critical seconds. That blind window was the whole reason for what happened next. At 4:31, the 4th boat fired again, a 5th torpedo entering dead ahead of the carrier, while the formation's ears were still ringing from the last explosion, timed, it was now obvious, specifically to exploit that gap. Once the picture cleared enough to see it, 4 Iranian boats had fired repeatedly, ignored every warning, and kept repositioning for more. The order went out across the whole force, weapons free against the launch platforms. What followed was less a chase than a methodical dismantling. The eastern destroyer put warning shots across the first boat's bow, then, when it turned toward the tanker instead of stopping, put a round into its engine spaces and watched it go dead in the water. The cruiser took the 4th boat under fire on the Seahawk's queuing, hit its engine compartment and watched its speed collapse from over 30 knots to under 10. 2 platforms down. The 5th torpedo, meanwhile, turned out to be running on a fixed intercept course rather than actively homing on the ship's noise, harder to fool but also less able to correct, and the sonar officer found a gap on its eastern flank, barely 200 yards wide. The order this time was almost eerie in its simplicity. Hold course, hold speed, don't touch the rudder. The bridge went quiet, except for the range calls as the weapon closed to under 1,500 yards, ran parallel down the port side close enough to hear on the hull sensors, and detonated behind the port quarter without ever finding the hull square. Another deep concussion, no penetration, propulsion still online. 2 boats remained capable of fighting. One ran west toward commercial shipping, the other south while broadcasting a jamming signal strong enough to register across the whole formation. And behind them, the 2 disabled boats simply drifted. It still wasn't over, and the analysts in Combat Information Center knew it. Find every launch platform. Clear the battle space became the new order, and it was the E-2D Hawkeye stitching together radar, sonar, and every ship's sensor picture into one network that finally exposed what the surviving boats were doing. The western one hiding against a container ship, the southern one spoofing multiple radar returns off a single hull. 2 Super Hornets launched off the forward catapults, the elevator damaged in the first hit, still locked between decks, but the cats themselves fine, and ran the remaining boats down one at a time, flying low enough to force the western boat out of the container ship's shadow so the destroyer's gun could finish the job with 2 rounds to the bow. The 4th boat didn't fight to the end. It went dark instead, engines off, transmissions stopped, wake erased by the waves, and for a while the Seahawk searched empty water until a sonar buoy caught something almost too faint to register. A slow, quiet object on a northeast heading that wasn't aimed at where the carrier was, but at where it would be several minutes later. The ambush had one more layer built in. The captain had 2 bad options and picked the one that felt more addressable. Turned toward the suspected contact rather than the drifting boat, and the Seahawk's infrared found that last boat sitting dead in the water with a crew clustered around a console, a cable running down into the sea. It wasn't launching anything. It was steering something that was already there, guiding an underwater object it had planted before the fight even started. Jamming went out from the cruiser and from an airborne electronic warfare aircraft overhead, and the guided object wandered off course under the interference until the boat boosted its transmission power to compensate, which was the mistake that let the destroyer's 5-inch gun put a round into the antenna array and kill the link outright. The underwater contact lost its steady course, curved off into a wide circle and drifted south. All 4 boats were now neutralized. For the first time in 25 minutes, nothing hostile was actively closing on the ship. It didn't last. A new sonar buoy dropped behind the carrier, picked up a motor spinning up almost directly astern, something that hadn't been launched by any of the 4 boats, because all 4 were already dead in the water. It had been sitting silent since before the fight began, waiting specifically for the ship to be maneuvered into this exact spot. Bearing 184, 2,200 yards, closing fast. Every turn up to this point had been herding the carrier toward this one coordinate. There's something almost unsettling about that if you sit with it. 26 minutes of fighting, and the real trap wasn't any single torpedo, it was the geography itself. With impact 73 seconds out and no time to outturn it, the captain called for more speed instead, which only made the stern louder and more attractive to a torpedo already locked onto propulsion noise. The nearest destroyer understood the only real option left and ran straight into the carrier's wake, deliberately building a stronger, sharper acoustic target and pulling it away. Decoys went out in sequence, one at 1,700 yards, ignored, the torpedo still locked on the original target, until the destroyer poured on full power itself and became, briefly, the loudest thing in the water. The weapon shifted onto the escort. Nobody on the carrier's bridge mistook that for good news. A torpedo now had a warship at 1,300 yards and closing. The destroyer's answer was almost surgical. It read the seeker's behavior, reacting hardest to changes in propeller speed rather than steady noise, and built a plan around that single weakness. Full power to create the biggest possible signature, a decoy dropped to inherit it, then an abrupt reversal to vanish out of the trap it had just set. At 600 yards, the final decoy went into the water. 2 seconds later, the ship reversed engines and put the rudder over, ducking out of its own wake while the torpedo ran on toward a sound that was no longer attached to anything. It detonated behind the stern at 4:45 and 12 seconds, water over the aft mast, consoles flickering, a steering sensor faulting and recovering, but the ship stayed under control and the carrier kept moving east, untouched by that final shot. 90 seconds of searching by every sonar in the formation turned up nothing. At 4:47, the report the whole strike group had been waiting for finally came through. No active torpedo contacts. Damage control finished its sweep bow to stern, 2 compartments with electrical faults, minor structural deformation near one service space, no shaft damage, no penetration of the flight deck. The ship that had absorbed 6 torpedoes in under half an hour was still capable of flying aircraft, and did. A Super Hornet went off the catapult again at 4:52, steam curling down the deck as if the last half hour hadn't happened at all. Looking back at it afterward, in the debrief and on the plot, the shape of the whole thing became obvious. 1 torpedo to force the turn, a second waiting for it, 2 more closing the north, a 5th timed to the noise of an earlier hit, a 6th left silent at the exact point the other 5 had been herding the ship toward all along. 6 shots, 1 plan, staged rather than simultaneous. It very nearly worked, because it assumed the carrier was fighting alone as a single target. It wasn't. The sonar teams heard it coming, the escorts stepped into its path, the helicopter found the boats hiding in plain sight, the Hawkeye tied every sensor into one picture, the fighters kept civilian shipping out of the crossfire, and the jamming crews severed the last link holding the whole ambush together. Whether that kind of layered, instinctive teamwork under pressure is something you build through training, or something that only shows up when it actually has to, that's the part worth sitting with. By the time the sun came up, 4 boats sat dead in grey water behind a formation that was already moving on, and only one side in that fight had ever really been acting as one.